Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today, to continue with the topic or general topic of zoology, we talked about zoology and from an evolutionary perspective. We're also going to talk about zoology from an ecological perspective, and in this course, that's kind of how I'm going to approach the topic at hand. So I'm going to talk about the classification of what makes something an animal, but we're going to talk about it from a evolutionary perspective, but also talk about it from an ecological perspective. Okay, so to look at that, we can talk about how organisms interact with their environment. For example, what role does things like wolves play on, elk herds, or what role does it play in production or stabilizing things like scavengers like ravens and whatnot. And then what role does that all those pieces have in just plant growth or decomposition, nutrient cycle, these kind of things. Okay, so to begin with wolves in Yellowstone, there's a lot of, well, in some aspects, a lot of misinformation, I think, out there when it comes to wolves in Yellowstone. And we can talk about each step when it comes to that. Okay, so let's talk about wolves in Yellowstone as a good example of that interconnection of species, plants, carnivores, detritivores, um, just in general that connection, that ecological perspective of how organisms interact with their environment. So in Yellowstone, the last wolf before the reintroduction was killed in 1926. Okay, so we really had roughly 60 years or so, maybe a little more. Okay, yeah, so about 70 years or so without wolves in Yellowstone National Park in the state of Wyoming. So I'm talking about Wyoming. I believe the last wolf in Montana Yellowstone was killed in 27 maybe, or 1928, a little bit later, but in Wyoming, 1926. So just to set the story straight with individuals who make comments like the wolves that were reintroduced to Yellowstone are much larger, much bigger than any Yellowstone wolf that originally was in Wyoming. Okay? And that's a very common comment that a lot of people like to state. Okay? So here's an example of a wolf that was killed in Montana just a couple weeks ago, I believe. Fairly large wolf. Okay? There is a wolf that was killed in 1931. Okay? In Montana, just outside of Yellowstone National Park. As you can tell, now here you can see it's just the pelt, but again, a wolf is easily as tall as an average sized man. The wolves are no different, same species, and yes, they were introduced from Canada into the Yellowstone National Park. However, the corridor used to be unblocked, so Yellowstone National Park wolves could move into Canada and back into Yellowstone. So there used to be a corridor in the 1900s, early 1900s, that would allow free range of those organisms. That was cut off with things like I-90 or I-95, whatever the road is, Highway 2. All these kind of cut it off, and the building of lots of towns and cities and things like that really cut off that corridor, and no more flow from Canada. So the reintroduction should come from Canada. It did come from Canada. The wolves are the same size. If you look at the data, The average wolf size really hasn't changed. It's actually a little bit smaller today than what it was in the early 1900s. So the premise is nothing really has changed except for we had a 70-year period without wolves. So we might ask questions like, well, what happens when you reintroduce wolves to a region where they've been gone for 70 years? What role do they play? What kind of changes can you expect for the habitat to go through, the ecological point of view? In 95 and 96, in Yellowstone, wolves were reintroduced, and 31 wolves came into Yellowstone from Canada and received protective status. So we can approach this from a lot of perspectives, and ecologists often do. So Doug Smith is the lead wolf biologist in Yellowstone, and his perspective might be to examine wolf populations. What do the wolf populations do? Are they increasing, decreasing? Okay, how many different packs do you have? What is the makeup of the pack? How many, individual wolves are there in each pack, and all kinds of things. Okay? Where do they roam? What are they consuming? What's their main diet? These kind of things. But apart from that, you also have biologists like Bill Ripple and Robert Bichetta who are plant ecologists. And so they're examining what role does the ecosystem play in helping the wolf population, and how are the wolves in turn changing the ecosystem. And so this is a great example of what we can see happened after wolf introduction. Okay? So this is in 2002. Okay? The wolves have been in the national park for about 12 years, for about 6 years. Yeah, 5, 6 years. And this is 2015. And you can see that according to Bichetta and Ripple, that the plant communities along riverbeds and creek beds have started to come back. Okay? So you have growth of willows, you have growth of cottonwoods that you once didn't have, and that was because, according to them, in their research, when there's no wolves around, elk and bison and ungulates, all the ungulates, all the food sources of wolves, can just sit there and eat. And they really don't have to move, and they'll take all the saplings and they'll just sit there and eat and browse and really consume a lot of food along waterways, because you got your water source and your food source right there in one area. But with the reintroduction of wolves, those organisms, they had to move away from waterways. They had to move into clearings. They had to eat a little more grass and maybe browse on plants that are away from the water, because when you're down in the water along the banks and things like that, escaping from a predator is much more difficult. So they moved away, and that's really what allowed the plant communities to survive. And you can kind of see how that introduction has changed. So in the case of wolves, between the 2 years, 95, 96, 31 or so were introduced. Okay, so this is the wolf population in Yellowstone, and its highest it ever got was about 105, 108, somewhere in that region. And the elk population has always been in the upper thousands. So the highest the elk population got was during the time that wolves were introduced. Okay, in 2000, the elk population was right around 14,000 elk in the national park, and that steadily started to decline. And you can kind of see that there's a relationship, a cyclic relationship. As the elk population declined and the wolf population increased, the wolf population eventually declined, and the elk population started to increase, and they kind of go back and forth. Now, I'll tell you that the elk population is on the incline, the wolf population is on the decline after this. This only shows you 2011. But there's this cyclic relationship between the organisms. And that's important to know from not just an animal biology perspective, but this is also showing the connection to the plant community. It's showing the connection between predator and prey and how that really institutes this alleviation of predation from an ungulate to predation to a predator. Right? So the ungulates are, now compressed by predators, so there's less ungulates, they have less free range, so the plants get released. They're the prey of the herbivore. They get released of that pressure, so they have the ability to grow. You remove the predator on top, its prey gets released, they have the ability to grow. Okay, and by knowing this and having this understanding of the cycles, we now can manage populations in a better way. So we often want to know, what is the relationship between human populations and animal populations? And so here you can see that, since the 1800s, the world's population was about 1 billion, maybe a little bit less, and it's gradually increased over time, okay, to the world's population about 7.7 billion, or 7,700 million. And with that, you can see a drastic increase in the number of extinctions. Now, some individuals might claim, well, that's because science is becoming more popular as the number of people have increased. But I think you would probably state that even in the 1850s, this is when Darwin was describing how species change or evolution, we had a pretty good knowledge of species in certain regions. And clearly by the 1950s, there was lots of scientists, okay? And it's probably not because we have more eyes out there examining the extinctions. It's because there are more extinctions. It's because the human population is outcompeting a lot of organisms in different regions. So not only do we have this issue with not understanding the connection between animals and their environment, we often change their environment, or we'll often change the animal. So removal of wolves in Yellowstone, or the introduction of new species into an environment. So that's where ecological perspectives come in. So ecology, just for your information in case you don't know, is a relationship between organisms and their environment. So if you're an ecologist, you study this. There's lots of varieties of ecologists. Population ecologists study how, like normally just a single population, a single species, and how that population might change over time, or the relationship of that population to their environment. Individuals that consider themselves community ecologists look at all the populations in a given region. So maybe you're a desert community ecologist, or maybe you're looking at a specific desert. Maybe it's the Sonoran Desert. And so you look at lots of organisms. You look at all the animal populations, including insects and reptiles and mammals and things like that, and you're examining how they interact with their environment. What's the relationship between the organism itself, the animal, and their environment? And so there's lots of ways at which you can be an ecologist. You can study very small single species ecology or large community ecology. But nonetheless, when we fail to understand the ecological relationship of animals to their environment, there are detrimental consequences. In the case of Yellowstone, when we removed wolves from Yellowstone, the ungulate, mainly the elk population, exploded and took over. And so you had less vegetation, you had banks caving in, there were no beavers left, The fish communities were decreased, the amount of amphibians had decreased, and so it really took a large toll on the ecosystem. Now that wolves have came back to the ecosystem, we're starting to see beavers come back, you're starting to see ducks that are breeding in the pools, you're starting to see or setting up nests and breeding in pools and beaver dams. You're starting to see amphibians breeding and fish habitat is becoming better. Your banks aren't eroding as much. And so you're starting to see these consequences be reversed. A similar situation has occurred with the removal of mountain lions in Zion National Park in Utah. Same kind of thing. You remove the mountain lions inside the park, and there's certain regions of the park where those mountain lions have not been disturbed and they haven't been removed. And those regions are doing much better than the regions that they have been removed. And that's mainly not elk, but now we're dealing with mule deer and huge populations of mule deer consuming all vegetation along the riverbanks, and the riverbanks are starting to erode. And again, you get the same kind of thing, just a different region. Okay. Another situation, and we'll talk more about the Nile perch, is when we introduce species because we think we're going to do more good than we are harm. Okay, so for example, in in the 80s, we decided okay, I guess Europeans mainly decided to introduce Nile perch, or thought it would be a good idea to introduce Nile perch to Lake Victoria. Okay? Lake Victoria is a very large lake in Africa, and through that introduction, along with the help of environmental change and things like that, we've seen a reduction of about 300 species of fish. Okay? And a lot of those species of fish that we've lost from Lake Victoria were food fish for the native individuals. Okay? And we thought by adding Nile perch that they'd be able to catch very large fish and they could feed more of the community. And indeed, Nile perch are very large fish. Okay? You can see one here. However, with the reduction of species, and now with the reduction of Nile perch in the region, there's really a lot of species that are missing. The other things that we've seen is we've had to add or introduce even more exotic species like the Nile tilapia to try to combat the mistake by adding the Nile perch. The connection was not there. So it was a huge ecological blunder and has cost a lot of species. Some of those species that have now gone and disappeared from Lake Victoria or extinct from Lake Victoria probably could have established themselves in warming water, but tilapia is not one of them, and neither is the Nile perch. So those populations are starting to decrease as the climate changes. Now again, the people around Lake Victoria, they can't do anything about a changing climate. However, the more species you have in a region, there are probably a better chance that some of those fish species could have changed with the changing environment. It just happens to be that the two that were introduced are not going to do so. So that's kind of the premise behind examining zoology from an ecological perspective, knowing that there is a relationship between predator and prey, but also between predator and the plant community and the phytoplankton community. And that it's not always clear unless you examine the ecology of a given region to know exactly what connects and what is going to connect to what, and what happens when you remove a chunk of the food web, or what happens when you add a new predator to the ecosystem, or when you take away a predator from the ecosystem, what's going to happen to the general community? Okay. So from zoology perspective, we're going to look at those two perspectives. Evolution, what has changed or how has genes changed over time. So basically, who's related to whom. And ecological, not just a genetic relationship, but what's the relationship ecologically between these groups. And so that's kind of how we're going to approach the study of animal biology, and that's how the course is kind of set forth here on. So we will talk a lot more about this endangerment of animals, or this connection between humans and the environment, humans and extinction rates and things like that. But most scientists, most biologists, most animal biologists would probably agree that the root of almost all environmental problems is overpopulation. And we'll talk a lot more about this as we talk about growth rates of population and things later on in the semester. But most estimates are that we'll get to about 9.3 billion people by the year 2050. Also, the estimates from ecologists is that 9 billion people is the carrying capacity of this planet. Okay, so we'll reach carrying capacity in 2050. Now, that's not that far out, roughly 31 years, okay, or so, and we'll be to that point. So in 30 years, 31 years, you can expect that the population of humans has got to a point where the planet cannot carry anymore. So what does that mean for other species? What does it mean for our species? We'll talk about that as we progress. And we can also talk about that from a perspective of, we know what's happened to other species when that's happened, when they've reached their carrying capacity. And so that's why it's important for us to look at the evolution and the ecology and examine them both, because maybe down the road the carrying capacity of this planet might not be actually 9 billion. Maybe it's 12 billion. And maybe based on world resources, maybe we're able to change the ecological relationship without making other organisms go extinct, and with helping ecosystems strive and survive. But we know right now that overpopulation has also taken a toll on the world's resources. And we're going to talk about that from a perspective of, how does that alter or endanger other animals? So what does climate change, deforestation, water shortages, how does that relate to the extinction of species? All right, so that kind of sets the tone for the course. I know it's kind of a drab tone, but I promise you there are some positive pieces. All humans are not, destroying everything, right? And there are ways at which we can alleviate some of that extinction or that endangerment to animals by just using some common knowledge and common ecological principles. And we'll talk about those as we progress through the course. So one that we'll often talk about is, are there solutions to dealing with overpopulation? We don't have a predator, so are there solutions to human overpopulation? But then what are some other solutions to deal with overpopulation of other organisms? Okay, and we'll approach those at a later date. All right, so with that, next topic, we'll start talking more about evolution and ways at which organisms evolve, and then we'll go into kind of some systematics and how we name organisms, and then we'll progress right into the very first group of animals, which we call peripera.